What is it that stirs us to pray? We've all had similar prayers like Sonny. He was wanting to kill himself. He wanted to be done with life, and so he thought he would swim out, and he finally got to the place where it was going to happen. Then he realized, I want to live. And then he started bargaining with God. And it's always interesting because when we do those, whatever stirs our prayers, whatever makes us to that place that we cry out to God, God meets us there. And many times we do exactly what he did. We try to bargain. We offer a lot of stuff up. And then when God actually comes through, it's like, ooh, I think I overpromised. And we start trying to adjust that. Last week we started our series as we looked at Neil. We're looking at some of the prayer heroes in the Bible, and Gabriel helped us look at Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat really had made some unholy alliances, and he made some mistakes, and that stirred him to prayer. And Gabriel helped us understand all that is and a part of his story. Today we're going to look at somebody whose life is not fair even when we're faithful. Have you ever had those circumstances where you've been faithful and yet life hasn't worked out? I know some of us, if not all of us, at some point have had that moment. And so as we walk through the scripture today, I want to invite you to think of yourself in the story. And so we're going to take a moment and we're going to ask a couple of questions, invite you to think about your story, and then we're going to look at the story of Hannah. Now, this is a story of bullying. Things were not fair. It was not a nice environment for her to be in. And so as we look at asking some questions, think about your story, then we're going to look at Hannah's story, and then we're going to kind of have that rhythm. And so I invite you to be thinking about what that looks like today. And Hannah's life was not fair. She lived in a set of circumstances that she didn't do, and she was trying to be faithful, and yet we pick up her story of how challenging it was. And so 1 Samuel, the first chapter. Now, these Old Testament passages are just big, long stories, and so we invite you to dig deeper and read. But in this situation, there once was a man who lived in Ramathaim. He was descended from the old Zuph family in the Ephraim Hills. Now, what you need to remember in the Old Testament, family and lineage mattered. This was before Ancestry.com and 23andMe were popular. Because it did matter, and that's why you had so-and-so was married to so-and-so, and Bar, which means son, or Bat, which means daughter of so-and-so, and they would tell you all this lineage stuff. His name was Elkanah. He had 2 wives. Now, what we also need to remember is he had 2 wives. It's not okay for us to have 2 wives. The first was Hannah. The second one was Peninnah. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not. That sets up the tension. And so as we look at that story, we begin to ask ourselves, who's in our life? Now, what's interesting is there's usually people in our life that will always point to the problem. Sometimes, hopefully, we have people in our life that will point to God. But we need to kind of get a sense for who's in our life. And we're going to look at Hannah, and we're going to see her story, who's in her life. But I want to invite you to be thinking about who's your support cast. Who are those people around you? Who are those people? Do you have more people pointing to the problem or more people pointing to God? Do you have anybody pointing to God? Do you have anybody pointing to the problem? Who are they? Where do they fit in? And so as you begin to think through your family and friend network, who's in your life, and as the story begins to play out, begin to ask yourself, what role do they play, and how do they help you, and where do they push you? How do they help you do life, and is it the life that you're wanting to have? So we pick up the story in verse 3. Every year this man went from his hometown up to Shiloh to worship and offer a sacrifice to the God of angels' armies. Now, you got to remember this is Old Testament worship. So we're used to kind of going, hey, I'll go online to worship. And we've got people joining us today online to be able to worship with us, and that's wonderful to have. We drive by 5, 6 churches just to come to this church, and that's okay too. We've got other people, and so we have worship regularly. But back in the Old Testament, they would go to the tabernacle, which was a big tent that would travel, and people would have to go to tabernacle. Or they would go to temple, which is when it was built, they would have to go, and then as the different ones, they would go to their hometown, and they would go different times of the seasons for sacrifice. And so it wasn't a regular type of rhythm of worship that we're accustomed to. It was the rhythms and the festivals and needing to go to different places. And so every year, this man, Elkanah, and his family would make the trip to worship. When Elkanah sacrificed, he passed helpings from the sacrificial meal around to his wife Peninnah and all of her children, but he always gave an especially generous helping to Hannah, because he loved her so much and because God had not given her children. So with the sacrificial system, there were a portion of the meat that was burnt offering and given to God, but the rest of that then was cooked up and they would have a communal meal. And so it would be passed around, not only to the family, but it would be passed around to those who were working in the temple, the priests and the priest helpers. And that's how they ate, and that was part of the offerings that were given. That's part of why we still have some of that offering system a little different today. And so we begin to see some different things take place. So you have Elkanah and his wife, Peninnah, and she had kids, but Hannah was the preferred wife, because he loved her so much. And his heart went out to her. And so we begin to see who is in Hannah's life. But what's interesting is the next verse begins to help us to see what's happening here. But her rival wife, speaking of Peninnah, taunted her, speaking of Hannah, cruelly, rubbing it in and never letting her forget that God had not given her children, kept pointing to the problem. Always. This went on year after year. Every time she went to the sanctuary of God, she could expect to be taunted. I mean, picture this. So they did not go like every Sunday, but every time she went, and they went regularly, she was going to be taunted. So it's time to go and give up sacrifices. It's time to worship God. Hannah knew, wonderful, it's going to happen again. I'm sure it happened in between, but we know for a fact it happened every time she went to the sanctuary. Hannah was reduced to tears and had no appetite. And so what we see here, can you imagine as she's sitting there going to worship, that she knew she was going to get taunted? Now, some of us have those. As we begin to make changes in our life, there may be somebody who points to the problem when we go to worship. We start changing our life and we start getting our life together. We may have somebody, it may be somebody living in our household, it may be a friend. Who do you think you are? You just got wasted last night. Don't you know what you've done up to now? You're a drunk, you're a drug addict, you're whatever. You insert the blank, and some of us carry that story with us. And some people in our lives remind us and will point to the problem, and every time we try to get our life together, somebody points to the problems and tells us how bad we are. Now, we may or may not have that person, but what I do know is sometimes we do it to ourselves. The enemy will whisper in our ear, who do you think you are? Don't you know what you did? Don't you know? And it's like, I'm trying to get my life back together. I'm trying to move toward God. But the whispers and the taunts and the jabs come to remind us of the problem. And they point to the problem, they don't point to God. But what's interesting is we see her husband, Elkanah. And now, ladies, I just want to acknowledge up front, sometimes we men, we mean well and we say stupid stuff. And he does. So I just want to acknowledge. And now, if this has ever happened to you, please don't point to the problem or the person next to you. Because we probably all have said this in some manner. Sometimes we men just don't know what to do. Now, honestly, sometimes you ladies may have done something similar, but I just want to acknowledge sometimes this happens. He says, "Oh, Hannah, why are you crying?" Seriously? Every year this happens. What do you mean, why are you crying? Does he not see what was going on? Why aren't you eating? Seriously. I mean, you're watching, it's like watching a movie. It's like, how come everybody else gets this but him? And sometimes we're so close to the situation. Now, this is where he says the stupid thing. Am I not more worth to you than 10 sons? Why are you so upset? It's like, seriously? You really said that? We've said that. Sometimes we make it about us. We don't mean to always, but we're trying to figure it out, and it's like, well, you know, we've got all this, and I really can't fix that, but I can at least fix this, and I'm trying to be there for you, and I do that. And so we see the cast. She's being treated cruelly. Her husband's trying to love her, trying to do some of those things, And sometimes in our own life, we have those people. Sometimes we may be another person in that mix, and we're trying to figure that out. And so that leads us to ask the question, what drives us? And where does it drive us? What are those things in our life that push us, that drive us? I'm going to ask you two sets of questions. This is the first one, to begin to think through some of those things. Begin to think through, what are those things that emotionally just drive you? And sometimes you don't think about it. Sometimes we're just living life. But begin to look at some of those trends and some of those patterns and realize, oh my gosh, some of those things from my past, the household I grew up in, the family from which I came, the background, the choices I made, the choices I didn't make. We have these things that just drive us. But we also have to ask, where is it driving us? Sometimes it drives us to workaholism and other addictions. Sometimes it drives us into places away from our family because the family was a source of pain. Sometimes it drives us into careers and vocations that are really not helpful, but it's going to help us make more money than where we came and have the right place and the right people and the right, whatever right is. So we have to ask those questions. What drives us, and where is it driving us? Because it may not be driving us in the place that's most helpful, but it's driving us. And so we pick up in verse 9, Hannah ate. Have you ever been in those situations where it's like, look, I just need to get out of here? And so she just like ate and got out. So Hannah ate, then she pulled herself together and slipped away quietly. She wasn't done, she wasn't being heard. And in just a moment, we'll see how much turmoil she was in. And she entered in the sanctuary. So her pain and her situation drove her to the sanctuary. She went into worship. The priest Eli was on duty at the entrance of God's temple in the customary seat. Crushed in soul, Hannah prayed to God and cried inconsolably. Cried inconsolably. She was broken. She just hurried up and got out of the table. She ate and just got out of there. But it drove her to worship. Literally moved into the place of worship where the priest Eli was residing. So that begins to look at some of the choices that we make. Who or what do we embrace? Who or what are we embracing? Because in those moments of those choices, we can embrace really good things and we can embrace really bad things. Oftentimes, we embrace not helpful things. We think it's going to be a helpful thing. But that also leads us to the second thing, and this is the second question I want to ask you is, what do you vow? Say, what do you vow? One of the things I learned a few years ago is sometimes, and all of us at some point will do this, we make a vow. We don't always know what it is, but we make a vow that drives us. Usually the vows are like this. When we're a child, we're a high school student, we're a young adult, we're in our first marriage, second marriage, we're in a bad work relationship, we make a vow. I will never, ever, ever let this happen to me again. I will never let somebody do this to me. I will never put myself into a place. I will always come out on top. I will always have the best car. I will always be number one. I will always. And so what I found is when we start saying, I will never, ever, ever, or I will always, 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 usually is a vow. I make a vow. This will never, ever happen to me again. And that vow drives me to make decisions. We never know it as a vow, but it begins to pattern us, and it drives us to make choices, many times not healthy or helpful choices. And many times we'll get into this cycle and we'll go like, why do I keep making these same decisions? Usually it goes back to a vow. Sometimes as a little kid, the household we were in, I will never, ever let this happen. I will always have, we make these vows as a kid. Sometimes as a high school student, something happens. Maybe it's on the bus, or maybe it's in a locker room, maybe it's in class. I get embarrassed. Never, ever again will that ever happen. We make these vows that drive us. In our first marriage, I will never, ever be a doormat. I will never, ever let somebody get this close to me again. I will never. And we make these vows that imprint us. And we don't always know it. And so I want to invite you to think, as you think through some of the cycles of life, have you made a vow that's been driving you, that has been imprinting the directions of your life? Last week we talked about Jehoshaphat, who made an unholy alliance. this week I want to ask you, what are those vows that might be unholy vows that you make that drive you? Now, Hannah made a vow, but the vow was a little different, and her vow is in the form of her prayer. And here's what she said. Then she made a vow. O God of angel armies, if you'll take a good and hard look at my pain, if you'll quit neglecting me and go into action for me by giving me a son, very specific request, I'll give him completely, unreservedly to you. No strings attached. She didn't have conditions on her request. Give me a son, I'll give him back to you. I'll set him apart for a life of holy discipline. So she was very detailed in her vow. If you'll answer my request, I will dedicate him back to you. I vow to dedicate him to you. So in the Old Testament, they had a first fruit offering, and she in essence was saying, if you'll allow my womb to be open, I'll give you the first fruit of my womb. Now, I just want to pause here for just a moment because I realize some of us here today are wrestling with infertility and have wrestled. That's a part of your story. That's a part of your pain. It was part of Hannah's pain. Hannah didn't say, make me have a biological child. She just simply said, I want a son. And however you choose to give me a son. So there are many, many ways that God can answer our prayer. So Hannah was open to how God would answer her prayer. And in just a moment, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. God answers biologically. But the question for us is, as we're praying, is not to come up to God and give him details and then get mad if God doesn't answer it the way we think. Be open to how God's going to answer. So the thing that we are able to understand is once we make some of those vows and we move towards God, not everybody's going to understand. Not everybody's going to get it. Not everybody's going to be excited now that you're making a change in your life and you're reading the Bible and you're going back to church, or you're going to church for the first time and you're starting to clean up some of the habits and some of the friends around you. Not everybody's going to be on board with that, and not everybody's going to be excited, and not everybody is going to understand. Actually, we see the priest, the religious dude, not getting it. It so happened in verse 12 that as she continued in prayer before God, Eli was watching her closely. The priest was keeping an eye on her. Hannah was praying in her heart silently. Her lips moved, but no sound was heard. Eli jumped to the conclusion that she was drunk. He didn't think, oh, this is a hurting woman. Oh, why is she crying? Oh, it might be something that she's seeking God. He jumped to the conclusion. She's spending time here mumbling and just kind of laying around there. She must be drunk. And so he went to her and he approached her and said, you're drunk. How long do you plan to keep this up? Sober up, woman. Sometimes religious folk can say stupid things. And he missed the point. And so what's important is when we're in those moments that we've got to tell how our story intersects with God's story. Because sometimes people don't get it. People don't understand. But when we begin to tell our story and how it's intersecting with God's story, it begins to help people have context. And that's exactly what Hannah did. Hannah said, oh, no, sir, please, I'm a woman hard used. I love how Eugene Peterson translates these passages. He puts it in words, and she just goes, I haven't been drinking, not a drop of wine or beer. The only thing I have been pouring out is my heart, and I've been pouring it out to God. Don't for a moment think I'm a bad woman. But then she begins to help Eli understand what she has been doing. It's because I'm so desperately unhappy and in such pain that I've stayed here for so long. I'm not drunk. I am desperate. I am so hurt, and I don't have anywhere else to go. I had to leave a table because nobody in my family got it. And so I'm here, and I am just pouring out my heart to God. But the cool thing is in that moment, Eli began to get it. Eli answered her, then go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked him. So he gave her a blessing, actually. Think well of me and pray for me, she said, and went her way, and then she ate heartily, and her face was radiant. Now, remember the first time that she ate to get away from the table. And we've all been there. Just let me finish this stupid meal and get me out of here. I just got to stop. Sometimes if we have the social graces, we'll finish the meal and get out of there. Sometimes we'll just leave. But the second time, when she was heard, and she felt that she had been heard by God as well as God's representative, she ate heartily. She ate heartily, and her face was radiant. A shift began to make. And so what we see is in our worship, God meets us. It's in our worship that God meets us there. She went and she poured herself out, and God met her there. Now, up before dawn, they worshiped God and returned to Ramah. Now, Elkanah slept with Hannah, his wife. Now, I love how Eugene Peterson puts it in such a phrase to help us understand what was happening. He slept with Hannah, his wife, and God began making the necessary arrangements in response to what she had asked. I'll do my part, you do your part. But what's wild is now in this situation, particularly those of you that are struggling in this area, God answered biologically here. But see, we can do our part, and God can still work to make the necessary arrangements in response, whether or not it's through social agencies, through other areas. So he didn't say that God could only answer in one way. She was open to however God would answer. And back then, that's how God answered. But in your situation and in other circumstances, we've got to be open for the arrangements that God is making necessary and be open to however God answers. Because she just asked for a son. She didn't say it had to be a biological son. She just said, I want a son. And so we're open to how God is going to answer our prayers. And what's important is Hannah follows through with her vow to God. She didn't do what Sonny did in the movie and go, hey, now that it's getting closer and hey, you answered my prayer, I'm going to start reneging. Instead of 50, it's going to be 10% and it's all of this. No, we see this begin to wrap up. So she has the child that's born. And then they went to temple the next year. And she goes, let God complete what he has done. So she did. She stayed home and nursed her son until she had weaned him, and then she took him up to Shiloh, bringing also the makings of a generous sacrificial meal, and then brought the child to Eli. So here she is, after the child's a little older. Hannah said, excuse me, sir, would you believe that I'm the very woman who was standing before you at this very spot, praying to God, prayed for this child, and God gave me what I asked for, and now I have dedicated him to God. He's dedicated to God for life. And then and there he worshiped God. And she literally gave the priest the first fruit of her womb. There's another passage that begins to unpack through Samuel about how Samuel grew up in the temple. And God gave her more children from there, but she was faithful in her vow. And so when we look at Hannah's prayer, we see that it has 4 characteristics. And so I want to invite you as you think through just kind of some of those things, and maybe you're in a situation where you don't know what to do and you're really struggling. We see that it was sharply focused. It was a very specific request. It's okay to be very specific with God in the request. Instead of like going, hey, God, however I want that. No, be very, very specific. God's okay with that. But the cool thing is, it brought her misery before the Lord. Her prayer, she was able to be very specific, but also very open with her misery. She brought her misery to other people. They didn't get it, but she brought her misery to God. It's very important that we can be honest with God and to share our heartbreak with God. God's big enough to take our anger. God's big enough to take our frustration. God's big enough to take our pain and our wounds. And she brought her misery before the Lord. The third thing that she did, she appealed to God's grace. God, you are the God of angels' armies. You are the one who can do. You have infinite resources. And in your grace, would you please move? And then the fourth thing, which is very important, this prayer addressed her master. Now, we don't do this very well. We like Jesus as Savior. We want Jesus to save us. We want eternal fire insurance. We love Jesus as Savior. We don't always like Jesus as Lord, because a Lord has master over the servants. And when we start going, I want you to be my Savior and my Lord, that begins to say, now Jesus has say in my life. And she said, I am your servant, you are my master. However you choose to answer, however you lead, however you guide, I am the servant, you are the master, and I submit myself to you. We don't do well with that. Especially if one of our vows is, I will never, ever, ever, ever put myself in a period or a moment of submission. Now, when you're being in an abusive situation, that's something good. When you're in a relationship with God, that's bad. And we can begin to see how those vows back then begin to pattern our relationship with God today. And so we begin to look at those characteristics of her prayer. And so I want you to think about, as you're praying, are you praying the problem? Or are you pointing yourself to God? And where is your focus? So when you think about your life circumstances, where are your life circumstances driving you? Where are they driving you? What choices are you making? Begin to think through, what are those vows that you've made? If you go back to, and most of us know those periods of time. They're usually childhood, high school, usually young adulthood, usually in bad relationships. They may be a bad work environment, but you know where they are. You may have grown up in one family and said, I will never live in circumstances like this. Whatever those vows are, just be mindful, and you might just have to break them and say, God, I just cancel those vows that I made, and I want to vow to live how you want me to be, not how I made these vows as a young person or as an older person. How am I praying? Am I praying the problem? Am I praying God's grace and God's lordship into the circumstance? And then what am I dedicating to God? What am I giving of myself and allowing myself to be dedicated? Do we give of those resources to God? Or do we say, oh, thank you for answering it, and now I know I said this, but really I'm going to do this, and we start reneging on those dedications. And so I invite you to begin to think through some of those prayers and some of those responses as you think that. And as we close with our time with prayer, know that God meets us in all these moments. So let us pray together.
Hey, thanks for watching the Sonrise Church YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this message, take a minute and hit the subscribe button on your screen. That way you won't miss a single message. If you'd like more information about Sonrise or become a partner in our ministry, send a quick message to prayer@sonrisechurch.info. Thanks again, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button.